A bit of background, I'm a bioarchaeologist, so I spend most of my time trying to reconstruct the lives of past individuals through the analysis of their skeletons. I'm currently a PI of the UKRI FLF Tobacco Health and History project, and the aim of this project is to try and learn more about the impact that the arrival and commodification of tobacco had on health from 1600 to 1900 in Western Europe. Now, for me to be able to do this, I actually need to have a good understanding of the relationship between tobacco use and disease in skeletons. And of course, we do get a good idea about tobacco use and what's happening in the past through historical sources, but we actually know far less about individual and group usage than we actually realise. So, for example, while art descriptions and economic sources can give us an impression, we don't know how this translates down to use on the ground level. So there are lots of questions about how much people are actually using tobacco, how much are women using it, how are they using it, when do people start using it, and most importantly, how much variation in use is there between different communities, societies, and of course in different spaces. So my work today, what I want to focus on is how we can potentially do this through looking at skeletons. Now, skeletons offer us a direct way to try and see how people are using tobacco in the past. And I want to show that by how analysing them, we can get a better idea of what you could call a demography of tobacco use in the past. This will, I think, give us a better idea about the role of this intoxicant in different spaces and communities, and will allow us to look, I think, more carefully at how tobacco might be influencing people's lives. And for me, I'm interested specifically in health and disease, but of course socially and economically and in lots and lots, and politically and in lots of different ways. So today I'm just going to give some pilot data of some work that I've been doing in the Netherlands, focusing on a rural community and pipe smoking specifically. And we know, I guess, the least about rural spaces, but I'm also going to be using urban spaces to sort of contrast this with to learn more. Like many others, I'm a bit behind because of COVID, but I'm still happy to talk today because I think we found some interesting things. I'm really looking forward to advice and thoughts and opinions from the people that are listening in. Before I start, I just want to say briefly that I do have a couple of pictures of human jaws and teeth. I know it's not everybody's cup of tea, but I just want to let people know so it doesn't come as a shock or a surprise. So I imagine that most people here are familiar with tobacco use history, but for those that might not be aware of what's happened in what is now the region of the modern-day Netherlands, I just thought I'd give a little bit of information. Like many places, it arrives in the late 16th century as a disease panacea, as a medical plant. It kind of arrives and it's established in the botanical gardens, particularly at the University of Leiden. And in the early 17th century, Neander and Beverwijk are praising it for its many uses for the population. So for fighting off hunger, fatigue, cancer, coughing diseases, the plague, and toothache, lots of different things. Now, pipe smoking, though, probably arrived a little bit later, particularly through interactions with the English, who have soldiers that are stationed there from, I think, 1585 through the Treaty of Nonsuch. We also have English people coming over and establishing a pipe production centres. Especially there are big centres that emerge in Amsterdam, Rotterdam, and of course Calder, which is the most famous of them all. So pipe smoking spread through the university, was popular with students, and eventually by the 17th century it's being consumed a lot. And it's thought that the Dutch are one of the biggest, if not the biggest, consumers of tobacco at this time. And travellers that come into the region, so Grosley in the 18th century comments on how much the Dutch are using pipes and are using smoking. Now, unlike England, there's also a thriving domestic industry that people often don't know, but they're cultivating a lot of tobacco here in the region of the modern Netherlands. And Bronga suggests that it's being grown at least from 1615 outside in rural Utrecht, the Gelderland, Overijssel and Amersfoort, which is perhaps the most famous for it. So pipe smoking penetrated all parts of society, including the rural, and it's people argue that it's already recreational by 1620. Snuff is then thought to be popular in the 17th century, and also it goes to all sections of societies, and male and females. Although Goodman argues that the Dutch really did like to stick to their pipes. In the 18th century, Dutch farmers are then producing a lot of leaf for snuff, and even though cigars are found in Amsterdam from 1667, they don't really become popular until the mid-late 19th century. And there's a cigar factory founded in Kampen in 1826. But throughout all of this time, the pipe manufacturing really remains very, very important to the country. And tobacco and pipe use is an important part of sociability, as it is elsewhere. It's something that is done with others, and it's associated very strongly with drinking. In drinking establishment, familiar with various of the drinking and smoking at the same time. And at this time, there's kind of a strange juxtaposition between it being seen as something that's the favourite thing to do, but it's also potentially morally questionable, especially when people are doing it in excess. It's also thought to be a strongly masculine habit, although literature does tell us that perhaps women were using it, they were using pipes, and it's suggested that in the 18th and 19th century, more women are using pipes at this time. And there are images of children using it too, and comments. And Cornelius Brontekoe specifically comments on females in the north of Holland using pipes in the 17th century, which is quite useful for me to know. So my kind of main key questions from this research was to try and find out whether there are differences in pipe use between rural and urban places and spaces. Do we see gender differences in pipe use specifically, and is it different between urban and rural as well? And can we get an idea of when people start to use it, and what differences do we see between different urban communities? So just to give you a bit of an idea about how we go about doing this, the analysis of skeletons really provide a wonderful source of direct information about people's experiences and population experiences in the past. And they just give us this opportunity to assess variables that we cannot necessarily get in any other way. And this includes just looking simply at the shape of a bone, but also what diseases we may see on bone, and then advances in biomolecular techniques and now letting us DNA of both of the individual, but also of the pathogens they might have, proteins, and importantly, the things that people have consumed, including tobacco. History, it is evidence of individual work with molecular. And the easiest approach, and the approach that I'm using today, is to look at the teeth and the telltale signs in the teeth. So you may know that clay pipes are actually quite abrasive. And what happens is if people hold them in their mouth, they abrade the enamel. And what we get, I hope you can see my arrow, is what we call are these pipe notches in teeth. And the other thing that we can also get is staining here, which you can see this dark, which is kind of tar staining and various other things. Now, people have been recording these for a while, but nobody's really sort of done anything much with the data. But they really do give us an opportunity to potentially look at pipe use within past communities. It's not perfect, there are some issues with it, but it's a really great start. We're also developing as part of the project a biomolecular technique that will hopefully let us detect breakdown products of tobacco in individuals such as nornicotine and various other things too. So the community that we've been focusing on is the community in the Beemster, and this is a rural sort of area that is north of Amsterdam, and it's a poldered area that was poldered in around 1615. Now, this is largely a dairy farming community, and records based on marriage certificates and military information suggests that large sections of the community are involved in this work, and people are listed as being labourers, farm workers, landowners, dairy farmers specifically, grocers, carpenters, butchers, etc., etc. There's very little on women, as it always seems to be, but they're listed as being maid servants, seamstress, and sort of housewife. Now, Midden Beemster is was the central sort of village, now I guess it's a town in the Beemster, and people from all over the Beemster were buried there at the church, at the Keizerkerk there, because the other 4 planned churches for the Beemster were never actually constructed. The records also indicate that most of the people that are buried there are in fact local, from local villages or towns, although there are a couple of people that had come from Germany. There are at least 2 drinking establishments in Midden Beemster at this time, and also in the southwest of Beemster down here, there is a tobacco factory. In total, 412 individuals of all ages and sexes were excavated from around the church as part of rescue excavations because they were constructing around it. And most of them date from 1829 to 1866, and we know this because of the reorganisation of the cemeteries. So we can be very confident that the individuals we're looking at lived their lives from the late 18th through to the 19th century. Based on, again, the archival records, but also material culture that's been excavated around there, we're looking at low and mid sort of status individuals. Now, to compare these guys with people from the urban spaces, I was able to get data from a number of other sites that have been published, and all of these are urban. So we got Zwolle, located here, Alkmaar over here, and Midden Beemster is in here, around here. Eindhoven, and then Roosendaal, which is here, and Gouda, which is here, and Hattem is just below Zwolle. And for some of the sites, so for Alkmaar and Zwolle, the individuals were buried, for individuals buried in the church, so they're actually quite high status, whereas the rest of them were low and kind of middle status, except for Gouda, which is our highest status site. Okay, so for the Midden Beemster group, we assessed for pipe notches in 68 adults. We couldn't do any more because they'd lost so many teeth. It was a real problem. We were able to look at 38 men, 25 females, and 5 individuals where we didn't know whether they were male or female. And so you can see up here the presence, the percentages, and really it was, use of pipe was nearly ubiquitous. So 90% of the males had at least one pipe notch. And then only 12% of females actually had one pipe notch. So it's very strongly associated with being male. What we also found was that there were lots of notches in all age groups, and there were teenagers that had multiple pipe notches. And it takes time to form these, so it means that they're probably smoking in their childhood. And in fact, there was an 8 to 10-year-old child looked at for another study that did have a pipe notch. What was also really surprising is that some people had lots of notches. So there's an example here where this individual had 5 different notches in his teeth. And what basically happens, I think, is the gap gets too big and they have to move the pipe because otherwise the pipe will roll over effectively. So this is evidence for really quite striking and chronic use within this. You can this staining as well. The urban sites and Midden Beemster. this group here, this graph here basically shows the different sites. It's broadly in time, but I wouldn't focus too much on that because they overlap a lot. The only one that is important is this early Eindhoven collection, and where there's almost no evidence, and that's not surprising because it's 1500 to 1650 at the very beginning of it. Male, orange is female, and grey is males and females having notches, and then only about 3% in the Hatton females, but 20% in the Roosendaal females. Then when we look at the higher status sites of Alkmaar and Zwolle, where people were coming in from the inside of the church, the rate drops in males to around 44%, 48% at Zwolle. But nearly, we don't have any females smoking at Alkmaar, and there's only 2 out of 120 female individuals at Zwolle that have evidence. Now, the late period in Eindhoven is intriguing because there's only 9% of individuals using it, using tobacco pipes. I would have expected it to be more like in between sort of Alkmaar and Zwolle and the other town sites. So basically, the most lower status sites of Roosendaal and Hattem had more pipe notches than the more high status individuals that were at Zwolle and Alkmaar. Eindhoven had around 9%, which is much lower than I would have expected in comparison to the other similar sites. And then Gouda had the lowest of only 6.7% of individuals with pipe notches. And this is the highest status site. So, and we'll come back to that in the discussion. I hope that is okay and summarizes it all right. So basically, people in the Dutch Republic, in the United Kingdom of the Netherlands, are using pipes a lot, both in towns and especially at rural Beemster. Even given some of the historic sources that discuss the high rates of tobacco use, the lot of importation of tobacco, and the pipe-loving nature of the Dutch, it did actually kind of surprise me, because we're looking at around 50% of males with chronic evidence for pipe use, and this probably underestimates it because it takes time to form these kinds of notches. So let's think about the research questions. In terms of rural and urban, there seems to be a very clear difference between the two, with nearly all of the rural Beemster men having a notch. And if this is reflective of rural communities, then there's potentially a number of interesting things taking place. Of course, it's possible that this reflects the lower status of rural groups. And excavations around the Beemster have shown with pipes, for example, they're very plain and they're very, very simple. And this also is the case of other kinds of ceramics. But as we have low status individuals also within the towns, and they also have nowhere near as much, it's very unlikely to purely be this on its own. So what is it then about rural space that perhaps is making a difference? It's possible that there's just less variation in how people were choosing to use it in the communities, with men mostly choosing to stick to their pipes, even though other options existed. And we know this is the case because there is a tobacco factory that is making and selling cigars. And I did have a picture of an advert specifically for cigars from this particular factory. What occurred to me is that basically men are doing manual activities, and they require both hands a lot of the time. So they're probably tending to hold their pipes between their teeth for a longer period of time than you might be if you were in an inn or a tavern, for example, in town. And Dunhill and Don Duco, who's looked at lots of excavations of pipes in this region, has found that it's certainly dominated by these short pipes that are sort of designed to allow you to do that. So tobacco, and specifically pipe smoking in this context in the rural space, might be serving the function other than or in addition to sociability. So using the pipe might be breaking up the day or the monotony of the task, or just being sort of more recreational. It's a bit like Michael was just talking about, maybe in the trenches, we're doing a different thing. Also, people may be just holding the pipe in their mouth out of habit, and this is something that is seen in many people that use pipes today. I discussed this with some people that use pipes. So it could be a habit thing. This may also in turn explain why the notches are more prevalent and also more advanced in some individuals. So of course, this doesn't mean that they're not using other types of tobacco too, and that, I mean, there is an inn and there are taverns in the area, but at least this specifically clay pipe smoking seems to be a real part of rural Beemster identity at this time. The opposite of this is that there are very few females that are identified as chronic users, and I can't really talk about differences between town and country because the rates are just so low for women in both spaces effectively. So this is kind of counter to these 17th century observations that lots of rural women in the north are using pipes, and it also becoming more popular. We don't seem to see that. So women, even away from perhaps these populous centres where there's less pressure or visibility, are still not using this habit, using the pipe. Of course, there are gender divisions and religious ideals that are also pervasive for these women, and it's seen as an undesirable habit, and this kind of probably mattered to them as well.
So I think we probably need to wrap up now. I know it's been difficult with the technology, but time is flying.
Can I just make one point about Gouda and Gouda, and then that's it? Or?
If you could be quick, that'd be great.
Yeah, so the fact that Gouda had the lowest rate is really, really interesting, considering this is where the most and the best pipes are coming from. And I thought that one thing that I should be thinking about is sort of the civilizing process by Elias. So perhaps we can think about the urban space maybe as being something that's seen as more civilized or more civilized practices, and the rural being perhaps more the untamed side. So perhaps individuals in this space have to kind of distinguish themselves by using pipes in a different way, maybe with mouthpieces and things, or other kinds of pipes, or just refraining from it and using, as we suspect, snuff and cigars at this time. And I will leave it there.